Okay, well, welcome everybody to Gresham College. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Keith Kendrick. I'm the Professor of Physics. And I'm going to give you now what is my third lecture on the general topic of reproduction. When we move finally away from sex, which I know has a great deal of interest, to perhaps the thing that's more important for most people, which is parenting. And so the general question, if you like, that I'm posing to you is clearly a controversial one, and one that many people would love to have a definitive answer to. And that is really, is having a good parent really more important than having good genes? And as I've just alluded to, I spent 2 lectures about sex, but in fact, sex, if you take the book of life, is really only the preface to a whole book about parenting. And I'm only going to be able to cover some aspects of that. David Lodge has actually put it that literature is mostly, it seems, about having sex and not much about having children. And of course, I think many of you will know here that life is very much the other way around. And since I actually spent a lot of my career working on the control of particularly maternal behavior in animal models, I have to point out to the far more numerous members of my colleagues who actually work on sex compared to parenting, that there's no real point in having reproductive success if the children don't actually survive to reproduce themselves. And this leads us to a very age-old problem which keeps coming back and indeed has come back in a big way, with a large number of books being produced by the likes of Steven Pinker, Oliver James, Steve Jones, and many others, Cohen, for example. And it really comes down to 2 questions in the context of this lecture. Can sexual partners continue to promote their interests through educating their offspring? And this was very much the kind of traditional view that's been held for, in fact, several hundred years, and perhaps had reached its peak in the earlier part of the last century with the behaviorists, notably John Watson here, who literally challenged the world by saying, give me healthy, at least one assumes that means genetically reasonable, infants, well-formed, and a world of my own choosing to bring them up in, and I can turn them into anything. The idea being, of course, that really the genetic makeup wasn't that important. What was important was the environment. Now, of course, things are very much batting the other way, and I'm sure most commentators will take the view that it's actually much more down to the genes that parents pass on, and thereafter parents are really only producing nutritional and protective support. Indeed, even Shakespeare made Prospero conclude of Caliban in The Tempest, a born devil, whose nurture can never stick, on whom my pains humanely taken, all lost, quite lost. And from my own point of view, perhaps you could summarize this. It's what parents are really about, is putting food and money in at one end and cleaning up the consequences, unfortunately, at the other, and that's really all we're there for. Now, I must emphasize, no matter what you might take home from this lecture, from what I will say later on about perhaps the impact that parents can have, any key adaptive behavior or skill will ultimately have to have a strong genetic basis. We mustn't get away from that fact. That isn't really the important thing at the issue. It's not simply about having specific genes, but also about the individual's interaction with their environment and how that, particularly when you're talking about complex behavioral genes, personality genes, intellect genes, how the environment actually fine-tunes their regulation. They're not they don't give you a particular characteristic by themselves. It's an interaction between them and the way that the environment causes them to change their regulation and produce proteins. So in essence, right from the start, I will say that the environment can enhance, ignore, or even perhaps downgrade what genetic advantages you may have in life, but what it can't do is to give you genes you simply don't have. Having started with that sort of little preamble, I'm going to backtrack now because this isn't just about the consequences of parenting, it's about why you parent at all and what controls it. So we're going to start by answering, or trying to answer, a number of questions. The first of which is, well, why take on parental responsibilities at all? The second, mainly from animal studies, but also what we know about human work, what makes animals actually show parental behaviors? And lastly, perhaps the most important thing in the context of what or how parents can actually influence their offspring is what promotes the formation of bonds between dad or mum and baby. Now, whatever species you look at, there are two very obvious reproductive strategies. The one is go for big numbers and then leave them to survive for themselves. And you have to produce large numbers because there's going to be a huge attrition rate. So these are Atlantic salmon, the female producing thousands of eggs. Subsequently, the male produces thousands of sperm to fertilize them. And then, in fact, in most cases, after their exertions of traveling back up their native streams, they will die, and the offspring will have to fend entirely for themselves, find their way out to sea, and come back several years later to mate for themselves. And as you can imagine, of those millions of eggs produced by an individual, very few will actually survive to make it for that return trip. This is fine, provided the environment doesn't get so challenging that simply too few of the eggs manage to make it all the way through to reproductive adults. So for the species, particularly mammals and birds, where we are dealing with very challenging environments, we go for small numbers of offspring and make sure that they go all the way, as typified by these elephants here, which may actually, the mother may actually look after her calf for some 5 years before getting pregnant again. So in general, the sacrifices of parenthood simply pay off by increasing offspring survival, particularly in the challenging environments that, particularly on land, we are exposed to. But what is parental care? I'm sure you all think you know what it is, but let's just consider the first generic definition of it, and it is generic, I hasten to add. It's any of the characteristics or actions of reproductive partners that increase the fitness of their offspring, but importantly, of course, it has to be to the detriment of their own. It's a sacrificial act. You could be doing other things. Believe me, you can. Indirect sorts of parental care, of course, are just simply how long you decide to keep them developing inside of you, the length of pregnancy, preparing and maintaining the nest site, like these birds are doing, but also, for example, the male might protect the pregnant female or the whole social group while the offspring are as yet unborn. And of course, once they are born, then we have a whole panoply of different behaviors shown by parents, notably in this case by the mother, towards, this is a marmoset, towards her offspring, is clinging desperately underneath and suckling from her, getting a huge amount of attention. The direct forms are the obvious: feeding offspring, keeping them warm, of course, comforting, protecting them, carrying them around, playing with them, and, of course, also training them to cope with life in general. So what are the adaptive advantages, therefore, of a species adopting a parental strategy? Well, I've already mentioned the first one, which is the increased survival potential of the offspring. The second thing, which is really important, is that by feeding and keeping warm your offspring, you actually promote more rapid development of the offspring towards adulthood. So they will become adults that much more quickly. They don't have to find food for themselves, they get given it. And that gives you a big metabolic advantage. And of course, by analogy from that, perhaps even more important, the most hungry organ in the body is the brain. And if you've got a parent around to stuff you with food and allow you to therefore have your energy given to you, you can afford to develop a big brain. And that, of course, is what has happened in mammalian evolution. And by doing that, we've also allowed for more flexibility to be built in with the way that the brain is controlling complex behaviors, which is yet another advantage in terms of being able to deal with challenging environments. So parenting is very much a very important step towards any species being able to develop in the most complex way in terms of cognition, for example. And finally, of course, social cooperation. Parenting is about really the roots of what makes a species social. Your first experience of the importance of social contact is through your parent. That's what makes you value social ties in general, and will promote, therefore, social cooperation, which of course reaches its highest in primate species, and notably our own. So who does the parenting and why? Well, of course, it comes as no great surprise that in most cases it's mum who does the parenting, and I'm only really going to concentrate mainly on mammals. I will have a few bird examples. And this is, of course, the normal case for pretty much the majority of mammals. And the reason for that is fairly obvious as well. That mothers already have had a high investment in producing a small number of eggs, whereas males, of course, produce huge numbers of sperm, and their actual best reproductive strategy is to spread it around as much as possible, whereas the mothers really need to protect their already high investment in producing a small number of eggs by continuing to protect that investment. I sound like an investment banker here, don't I? In terms of actually making sure that the young get through to adulthood. So it makes good sense in terms of the mother reproducing her own genes to protect her offspring all the way. And indeed, that all the way can be a long, long way, as we know as humans. But even in other species, like the elephants I already mentioned, perhaps a 5-year or more period before they even get pregnant again. And the same can be true of other primate cousins like chimpanzees. And very often the period of parental care far, far outlasts the simple early stage of nurturing through milk. It isn't just restricted to getting animals through to weaning in a lot of species. As I've already alluded, of course, it doesn't make a great deal of sense for a lot of mammals, which are ostensibly not monogamous, for fathers to get involved in parenting. It's in a sense, it's a total waste of time in terms of being able to promote your own genes, or your best strategy is to go and actually find another mate and get them pregnant and reproduce with them, and then go on to find yet another one. So very much it's the girl in every port type strategy. Don't want to be a father. And indeed, in some mammals, like the grizzly here, this is actually a mum, I hasten to add, the fathers may actually just see their kids as a snack, and they will eat their own children or anyone else's if the mother allows them to. So, what about other situations? Well, in only 3 to 5% of mammals, a very small proportion of mammals, do dads actually join forces with mums. And here are some of the examples. The fruit bat here, prairie and pine voles that you've heard me speak of in the last few lectures, and the beautiful looking Californian mouse here, deer mouse often called, hamsters, gerbils, meerkats, which I'm sure most of you will have seen, foxes, wolves, hunting dogs, marmosets, tamarins, the titty monkey, which is also a New World monkey, and of course, can't leave out humans in this respect. And it's not an exclusive definition of whether or not you have biparental care, but in normal circumstances, it's a natural extension of monogamy. And of course, it makes absolute sense in this situation for the male to get involved in parenting, because he doesn't actually have easy access to other females, so he might as well protect his investment with the female he's actually paired with by looking after the young with her. And in birds, of course, where a much higher proportion of species are monogamous and where males do often show paternal care, there is some example where it does actually benefit survival having two parents compared to one. It's not as great, perhaps, as you might expect, but there is a survival advantage in having two parents compared to one. The other thing it does is that once you've already extended the parenting from mum to dad, the chances are that actually other members of the social group, obviously notably immediate related family, get involved in, so it's allo-parenting. Everybody gets in on the act. So parenting can be quite extensive. A final, perhaps, little aside is a recent paper in voles, which actually, which are biparental, showing that, in fact, in this case, the females are often somewhat reluctant to take on parental duties, and in this case, the male will often grab them by the fur and drag them and place them on the nest. Enforced babysitting, coercion, you might say, of course, in humans that this is probably exactly the wrong way around. In rare cases, dads actually do it all, but I hasten to say not in mammals, as far as I'm aware at least. Particularly in birds like the phalarope, the sea catfish, plovers, flightless birds like the rheas and kiwis and emus, also moorhens, this barking frog, pipefish, and the star of the show, which I'm sure, hopefully it's going to come up in a moment. Okay, is the seahorse. Now, the seahorse actually, first of all, the female does get pregnant in the normal way. The male fertilizes her eggs, but she almost immediately transfers her eggs through to the male into his egg pouch, and he will actually develop the eggs himself. You can see he looks very pregnant here, and give birth himself as well, and he will then continue to look after the offspring, even though the female is still around. This is perhaps the gold star. I'm afraid the examples of this happening in humans are only in Hollywood, and Schwarzenegger and Jr. With Danny DeVito, showing what might possibly happen, but of course we all know it doesn't. So why should males in these species really become house husbands? It doesn't really seem to make any real biological sense. One perhaps trivial possibility is the females are just so pooped as a result of giving birth and being pregnant that they need to go like this one to a health farm and recover, and basically, you know, dad has to do it because she just can't. But that just doesn't really seem to be borne out, I'm afraid, unfortunately. What is a little bit more supported, of course, is where a female of any species is a better resource provider in terms of being able to get food. Then again, it would make more sense for the male to do it all and the female to get on with perhaps providing food. Perhaps the more controversial is this one, which is if females practice polyandry, which is basically having multiple males available to them, then they might as well do what males would normally do in non-monogamous relationships, which is it doesn't pay them to hang around like Alexis in Dynasty looking after the kids when you've got a whole load of males to go out there and reproduce again with. So perhaps there is a slight warning here to house husbands as far as the potential polyandrous lifestyle if they're the ones who end up looking after the babies of their spouses. Perhaps even more interesting is this one. A group in the United States did a survey of longevity of primate species, not humans, I hasten to add, non-human primates. And of course, most people expect that males don't live as long as females. But it would appear there's a very strong correlation with whether you do the parenting or not as to how long you live. So in primate species that actually where the dad does most of the work, he tends to live longer than the mate, suggesting that in fact there's something positively beneficial. I don't want to convince you, this is not a sales talk. In dads looking after the kids, they may actually live longer as a result of it. Now, as far as what makes, again, animals show parental behaviors, there are two phases that we have to consider. The first of these, we're probably most of us aware of, are the preparatory sort of nest-building behaviors. Also, in many species, the female will detach herself from her normal social grouping and may show heightened aggression, especially in ungulate species, towards intruders, particularly strange males. And then, of course, there's the area we all know about, which is immediately after the offspring are born, it kicks in a whole series of nurturing behaviors, licking the lamb, and ultimately, in this case, letting them suckle. And mothers will be extremely intense in their reactions to their lambs. And in fact, most species, like ourselves, The offspring themselves have the most powerful biological weapon for getting parental interest. It's not, so all of you have heard them before, especially if you listen to Robert Winston. Obviously, the human cry is pretty difficult for us to ignore, but it's the same if you're a dolphin, kitten, lamb, piglets, raccoons, and just to make you all right. The point is that actually all adult mammals, when they're inescapably exposed to babies, they can't get away from them. They'll either do two things. They'll either be parental or they'll kill them. I mean, there is no middle way. And it is a very, very powerful signal that babies have of any species, a vocal signal, to make sure that their parents act like parents. There is, of course, to all of this stress side of it, a downside, but it's also a protective side. If you're going to invest everything in terms of parenting and long pregnancies, if, unfortunately, life turns out that you get extremely stressed, food resources get scarce, of course you can recoup all of your losses by cannibalism. And those of you who saw the Channel 5 program last week will have seen a number of examples where mothers will actually cannibalize offspring when they have to. It's extreme, but it does happen. And it doesn't, I hasten to say, happen, as far as I'm aware at least, in the species that do very closely individually bond with their offspring. So what actually controls mum being mum? And this is a sort of technical bit of the talk when we go through things like hormones and so forth, but the patterns of hormone changes during pregnancy, this is a rat, are very, very similar, whatever mammal you look at. There are some changes, but effectively the sex hormones progesterone increase systematically through pregnancy, and then suddenly they go shooting down just before birth. Estradiol, the other sex hormone, goes up gradually and then it shoots up just before birth. Prolactin, which is an important hormone for actual producing milk, is also going up, tends to go up, in fact, in most species more gradually during pregnancy, but then also tends to precipitate upwards and continues to stay high during the whole period of lactation. And these hormone changes are very important for preparing both the mother's body, her uterus, her breasts, her milk production, for nurturing offspring, but also they will start to engender interest in offspring, because a lot of species are not interested in babies at all, except when they give birth. In fact, they find them positively aversive. They're sort of like a neophobic reaction to them. And in these marmosets, for example, this is their hormone profile. Again, progesterone going up and then going down, and then estradiol going up. If you actually get them to press a panel to indicate that they want to get access to somebody else's babies, it's not their own, because it's the first time, in fact, they're given birth, you'll see that as soon as you get these final changes in the last few weeks before birth, they suddenly show a much greater interest in working to get access to any sort of baby. And at this same time point where the hormones begin to change prior to giving birth, we also get the stimulation of nest building activities in birds, perhaps also in humans, of course, and, for example, rabbits. But the important take-home thing about these hormones is that they are really only preparatory. As I said, any species, if you expose them to young for long enough, will eventually become paternal, maternal, but it could take days or even weeks. And even with all of that beautiful hormone priming in place, if you then just expose a rat mother, for example, to pups, it will still take a day or so for her to respond maternally to them. And such a mechanism would obviously be totally useless if they are suddenly presented with newborns, because by the time they got around to being maternal, it would be too late, they would be dead. So it's actually the process of giving birth that triggers, in most species, the final drive for maternal reactions that occur in seconds rather than in days. And I don't want to blind you with thousands of science, but this is work from my own model of how complex this is. Signals from the uterus go up the spine through to parts of the brain stem, which have diffuse transmitter systems that actually fire off to all different parts of the brain and control most aspects of our behavior, particularly the noradrenergic systems and also the serotonergic systems. And these, by themselves, impact on a number of regions that control all the panoply of components of a maternal response, and they are quite complex. But the important thing that really makes this system work beautifully is that they also impinge on this little structure in the hypothalamus at the base of the brain called the paraventricular nucleus. And this produces, as you've heard me talk in the first and second talk, a very important peptide called oxytocin, which is important in bonding, in fact, in between the sexes. But in this case, it's also very, very important for doing two things. When it's actually stimulated by the uterine contractions, it facilitates the release of all of those transmitters that are already being released directly by itself, particularly in the regions that are controlling all the different aspects of the maternal behavior response. And there are a number of them. For example, the hormone changes that actually stimulate sex are very similar to the ones that go on during pregnancy. So one thing it does is to stop females from actually getting to be feeling sexually aroused in any way by males. It increases attention towards the baby that's just been born. Obviously, you can't run away from the baby as well, so the other thing it does is to help stimulate immobilization. You don't go anywhere. It also, of course, very importantly, stimulates the pleasurable feelings that you get towards your newborn infant, as well as the whole host of maternal behaviors, vocalizing, licking, suckling, and so forth that you will see in different species. And also, it'll stop the aversion towards the sensory cues and promote the process whereby you learn to recognize your specific young and the linking of that to the all-important reward mechanisms, the dopaminergic reward mechanisms in the brain. So it's a real bomb-proof system. It works extremely well. Complicated, I agree, but nothing in life with complex behavior is going to be simple. And for that reason, because those signals from going up the spinal cord are very important in most species, blocking them through epidural anesthetics or cesarean section delivery, at least in these species that are not normally maternal except after birth, will have some pretty severe effects in reducing or even completely blocking maternal responses to offspring. And you can reverse those simply by giving the animal an infusion of oxytocin into its brain. Of course, that immediately raises the question, well, what about humans? I mean, this is the natural childbirth lobby coming into its own. And of course it is to some extent, because what little work has been done shows that exactly the same changes occur in oxytocin when women give birth in the brain. And in fact, if they're delivered by cesarean or epidural, they don't happen. But the only behavioral evidence that's been shown for changes in human mothers as a result of this is perhaps an increase in the time it takes them to bond with their babies. There's no evidence that they are actually in any way poorer in their maternal response. And indeed, if any animal species, obviously, including our own, experiences severe pain, that can be far worse in terms of impairing maternal responses than the possible consequences of having an epidural, at least in humans, or cesarean section. Of course, the other thing I have to point out is that maternal experience facilitates the whole process. We all know second, third-time mothers are much better at dealing with the problems of parenting. And, of course, that has some other side effects. There's this one that I'm sure many of you have seen with the lioness that's persistently adopting oryx calves in Africa, a sort of predator and prey pairing up in a really strange way. But in fact, in a lot of species, very experienced mothers will steal neonates from other mums if they have the opportunity, particularly if they are pregnant themselves in the late stages of pregnancy. But what stops you becoming a mum? Because that's clearly very important biologically too. And We don't really know exactly, but the most likely explanation is it's simply that when suckling stops at weaning, suckling also will continue to stimulate this oxytocin system within the brain and therefore continue to promote the direct nurturing maternal type behaviors. So as soon as that happens, not only will they stop, but also the prolactin levels, which are helping produce the milk, will stop. And they are in general, high prolactin levels are generally fairly inhibitory towards the sex drive. And as a result of these two things, of course, what happens immediately is the female will restart her reproductive cycle. And in fact, it can happen within days sometimes for example, especially, for example, if offspring are killed. And this is clearly important because the mother must get ready for producing more offspring. And indeed, my own work has shown that to a large extent, sex and parenting, as you would expect, have to be in opposition. Hormones are very much determining that when you're a parent, you don't feel much like sex, and perhaps the other way around as well. What about dads? Well, as you would expect, with only 3 to 5% of mammals showing any tendency towards being dads, we don't know an awful lot about it, and a lot of what we do know originally came from work on birds. But in general, it's exactly the same, really, in many ways, as what's going on in the female. So prolactin levels also increase in a wide range of species, birds, but also these monogamous, the California mouse, also the wolf, and also the common marmoset, and in fact also in human dads. And not only that, they don't just occur when the babies arrive, they also occur even in anticipation, so several weeks before the mother actually gives birth. And in some cases, as in the fruit bat here, dads actually end up producing breast milk. It doesn't immediately mean that dads really can breastfeed. We've just been keeping it quiet all these years. But the biology, at least, will allow that to happen. Exactly the same hormone changes are occurring that promote milk production. And as I say, in this bat, they really do produce milk. The other thing that happens, of course, you've got to turn down the male sex drive, and that's partly caused by prolactin. Dads have lower levels of testosterone. This is human data now, it's different dads. They have a significant suppression of their testosterone levels. And there's a corresponding increase in their sort of female hormone levels, estrogen levels. And although it's not been looked at in humans, one thing has been shown in the California mouse, which is biparental, is that dads actually also show a greater propensity for their male hormone to be converted by normal metabolic routes to estrogen as opposed to other androgens. So this may be another way whereby testosterone effects that would normally be driving sex are bypassed towards parenting instead.
Excuse me, at what stage in the parenting process are those measures taken of testosterone?
In humans, before and after, you will actually see decreases in the same way with prolactin occurring before birth. They're not just occurring as the result of baby suddenly coming along. The other thing in some of the monogamous species that is known to be important is the peptide vasopressin, which is the sort of male equivalent in terms of bonding behavior, which I showed in my last talk, to oxytocin in the female. And some studies have shown that just the infusion of this peptide into this region of the brain called the lateral septum will actually make voles become dads immediately. But in general, what is happening, if you like, in a sort of very brief summary, is that dads are becoming mums as far as their hormones are concerned, and they're turning down their sex drive. And indeed, for that reason, it may be the kind of default. As soon as you start turning down the male sex drive, pretty much any species should therefore be able to show paternal behaviors, and indeed they can. So if you mimic these changes artificially, for example, in a completely non-paternal species, the rat, they will actually become dads. So it's not as if all those species that don't show paternal behavior simply can't. They can if the circumstances are correct. So what promotes the formation of those all-important parent-offspring bonds? Now, just to start with, I should say that although we have lots of different mammalian species, in general, those, like this pig here, that produce large numbers of offspring, large litters, don't tend to bond that closely or individually with their offspring. It's quite easy to change around babies. The same would be true for the rat, for example. Whereas in this, there's a bonobo here, but very many other species, and one I'm going to talk about later, the sheep, where they actually only have one offspring, very, very strong, or two offspring. They have very, very strong bonds, which I'll just go into very briefly what regulates them. So for mothers, I showed you the wiring diagram, so I won't show it to you again, but I already pointed it out to you. Oxytocin helps the process whereby they learn very, very quickly to recognize their individual baby, not just all of their babies, each one individually. And this recognition process is then rapidly linked through to the parts of the brain dealing with pleasure. So when you see your baby, interact with your baby, it's a pleasure. This is the bonding system in a nutshell. And this reward system is notably through a well-known transmitter called dopamine. However, it probably involves the endogenous opiates in the brain, the opioid systems, which, for example, in a sheep, if you actually give them morphine at the same time that they give birth, they become exaggerated in their responses towards offspring. They are sort of hyper-bonding with their babies. It seems a strange thing, but opioid stimulation seems to be important. For fathers, really, we pretty much imagine the same thing is going on, but as I mentioned before, it may involve more vasopressin than oxytocin. So overall, linking individual offspring recognition with the brain reward mechanisms is what makes for this lifelong bond, which will of course go way beyond the initial period of parenting. And you can see in a lot of very highly social mammals where they only produce one or two young, that offspring will hang around, in fact, with their parents even when subsequent offspring have been produced. It doesn't just limit the bond to the period of when you're being actively looked after by your mum or your dad. So let's go now to thinking about the impact that you are a parent, and I'm particularly looking at the individual species that bond with their babies. What happens in terms of your potential influence on them apart from just giving them your genes? And I'm going to base what I'm going to talk on mainly where we have animal data. There's a huge amount of human data based particularly on the fate of monozygotic twins that are raised by different families and so forth. But of course they tend to be on very, very small numbers and they tend to be very, very controversial. It is possible, however, to do the kinds of more objective studies on some animals at least to try to tease out how important parents are. And one of the main techniques for doing that, as I'll show you in a moment, is actually cross-fostering, which is to raise the young of one species by the mother of another. And those two species will have different characteristics, and you'll see whether the mother will pass on her species characteristic to offspring, even if they're genetically from another species. But the other thing, of course, that have been done with animal studies is to look at what happens if you just don't have parents. And the first of these very controversial studies by the Harlows back in the 1960s that I've already mentioned before in a previous talk, where infants were actually raised without mothers, with surrogate mothers. They had all the sort of touchy-feely type side of the mother, but no positive interactions. And as I'm sure many of you will know, these infants then grew up to be pretty much social misfits and also had problems in many cases with their sexual behaviors. Similarly, although we don't do this anymore, thank goodness, in the old days, animals, particularly chimpanzees, used to be hand-reared in zoos so that they would be very human-friendly and they could entertain us through tea parties. And of course, unfortunately, I've seen some of these way back, and they were completely messed up socially with their own kind. More recent studies, perhaps more significant in this respect, is where the same sort of macaque-type monkeys, they weren't rhesus in fact, but they were another species of macaque in the United States, have been raised without parents, but in sort of big juvenile groups, a bit kind of like an orphanage, I guess. And these monkeys end up with exaggerated stress responses and also they have a much greater propensity for abusing alcohol if they are given access to it. And indeed, although I hasten to say you must take human studies with a definite pinch of salt. For example, this recent study on Romanian orphanages have suggested that similar kinds of social and stress adjustment problems may occur more often with orphaned and abandoned children. However, it is important to say that these may not necessarily be parent-specific, but could actually be simply the nature of the kind of care that you get from any particular individual, and adults are better at it, for example, than juveniles. But what kind of, okay, an absent parent is pretty bad, but what happens in general, it doesn't really matter what sort of parent you are, what influence could you have? And this is an area that I've worked on, extending really from the observations from Konrad Lorenz here, but also Nico Tinbergen in Geese and Ducks, where they found, and this is the film Fly Away Home, where they actually printed on the human with the microlight. The phenomenon is that they appear to learn almost immediately post-hatching the characteristics of their caregiver, which is obviously normally going to be their mother. And they will therefore follow her. Not only will they do that, but that also sets up the sort of template for what they find socially and sexually attractive for when they grow up. So if you cross-foster these avian species, so you get different species looking after one another, when they actually grow up, they prefer very strongly, almost exclusively, to socialize and mate, and recognize even the mating sort of behavior of the species of their mother who's looking after them, a foster mother this could be, rather than necessarily their own species. And this is a very stereotyped response. And as you probably remember from my first talk when I was talking about attraction, one of the ideas is that one way of promoting your own genes in successive generations is to make sure that you're attracted to individuals that look like yourself. But of course you don't know what you look like if you're most animal species. So the nearest thing you've got is your parent. They can provide you with a template for determining what you're going to subsequently find as socially and sexually attractive when you grow up. So this kind of imprinting mechanism seems to fulfill that. But does it happen in more advanced species like mammals? And in 1991, a South African zoologist, Professor Skinner here, came to see me in Cambridge, and he knew that we could control the maternal and bonding behaviors of both sheep and goats, which bond very strongly with their offspring. And he suggested that we did the first full-scale study in a mammalian species that has this kind of bonding behavior to see really how important mother might be in passing on her sort of template to her offspring to determine what they would find socially and sexually attractive when they grew up. And we did it took a lot of time and effort, and a lot of animals, but we tried every single possible combination you could think of to try to see whether mother was more important than other things. So, for example, we had a nanny goat raising a lamb and also a kid of her own. Also, we had, for example, a nanny goat that would raise two lambs. So, for example, it's possible that the sibling bonds might in some way counteract the mother bond. But the other thing we did was we didn't simply raise them in isolation, which perhaps if it got any effects you wouldn't have been that impressed by. We always had them in multi-species groups, so they had access to both species, their own genetic species and their foster mother species at all times. And we also raised animals normally in the same social environment and saw what happened. When they were growing up, goats and sheep show different sorts of juvenile behaviors, particularly in terms of their intensity. So goats tend to groom themselves more and they play a lot more than normal sheep do. And as you can see from the cross-fostering information, the goats that were cross-fostered onto sheep actually ended up showing reduced levels, so they were more like sheep, but not completely. And by the other analogy, the cross-fostered sheep onto goats showed more like a normal goat pattern, but it wasn't a complete reversal. and a whole load of other behaviors, such as the pattern of vocalizations, climbing, escape behaviors, as goats are escapologists extreme, and also browsing behaviors were totally unaffected, implying a very strong inheritance a component to those sorts of behaviors. However, the real acid test was when they grew up, and we took them at sexual maturity and gave them daily tests where they were exposed to males and females of both species. They were tied up so they could make all the choice. And this is actually an example of a cross-fostered goat that initially, in fact, has gone to a male sheep, and then he'll go around and he'll, I swear there are actually goats on the other side of the barn, you can see that at the moment, and he will actually, this is normally raised sheep, so she finds it a bit of a surprise, and he will actually, as you can see in the pictures here, mate with her. Now the question is this the exception or is this the rule? And the answer is it's the rule. So in this first year, with the cross-fostered male goats and the male sheep, pretty much, not quite, it's about 90% of choices were towards a female of your foster mother species, not your biological species. And that contrasts with the other normally raised animals in the same social environment, which were completely interested only in members of their own species. And having a twin of the same species as yourself made absolutely no difference. Even though they do form sibling bonds, they're just like human children in that respect. It didn't actually offset mum's importance at all. We then thought, okay, or maybe it's just a transient thing. Mum had an influence on year one. Perhaps it'll all change in the light of experience. So we then put them back into single species groups containing only their own biological species. And we did that, in fact, for another 3 or 4 years. And the take-home message, at least for boys, is they still continue to prefer to have sex and hang out with females of their foster species. It's not that they don't find their own species sexually interesting. They do. They will mate with them. But if you give them a preference, if you give them a choice, they will show interest primarily in their foster mother species. And as I say, this continued to go on with no diminution all the way through the whole of the study. And it doesn't even seem to be important for whether or not you have testosterone around, at least for the social interest. Even the castrated males would show this interest in, almost tunnel vision interest in members of their foster species, at least in that case for social interactions. Females were also very strongly affected, but not to the same extent. So they ended up with about a 50-50 choice. That compared, and having a twin of the same species didn't in any way ameliorate that influence of mother. However, when we put them back in their same species groups, certainly within 2 years, they'd completely reversed to being sexually interested now in only members of their genetic species. They showed, in fact, still continued to show a social interest in members of their foster mother species. But as far as sex was concerned, they were definitely only interested in their own species. And as I've also mentioned in the past, and it will be a subject of two lectures in advance where I talk about individual recognition, sheep actually and goats use visual cues from the face to recognize one another. And that's where they also derive attraction from one individual over another, primarily, not exclusively. And we actually found the same interest in the cross-fostered animals towards faces, in this case, just pictures of their foster mother's species compared to their genetic species. And the same kind of patterns were shown by males and females. And although nothing really of this kind has been done in primates, as you would expect, it's extremely difficult, a scientist called Fujita in Japan has shown similar effects, at least with visual images of monkeys with different macaque species that are cross-fostered between one another. There is a strong tendency for babies raised by different macaque species to end up, when they grow up, preferring to see pictures of members of their foster mother species rather than their biological one. Does this have any relevance to humans? Well, of course, we're all well aware, particularly of the strong male effect that we've seen of the old adage, I want a girl just like the girl that married dear old dad. And the only ones who've been brave enough to try this is a long time ago, Chris Hamilton and McGowan in 1929, and it's only based on 100 men. And you could say things have changed a lot since 1929. They asked the question, were men more likely to marry or have wives that resembled their mothers? And you can see immediately from this that the answer was no. They pretty much didn't. However, he asked them the second question, which was whether they were happy or not. And then everything changed. So as you can see, the ones who said that they did have wives resembling their mothers were relatively happy, and very few were unhappy, whereas those who didn't marry or have wives who were resembling their mothers reported themselves to be considerably less happy. Perhaps even more worrying is the group who didn't know one way or the other, but we won't go into them at all. However, these are really anecdotal sorts of stories, and a scientist in St Andrews in Scotland, David Perrett, who you may have seen on Robert Winston's program, is trying to look at possible facial attraction derived from parents, looking at a number of simple features. In this case, he's reported that the age of your mum and dad can influence whether you like a younger or an older partner when you grow up. And this is just showing you the results of his aging morphing program for what nature couldn't do, because they died too early for James Dean and Marilyn Monroe. He's able to systematically alter pictures to make them age, give them wrinkles and so forth, the kind of thing you'd never want to do. But he's used this to actually show that in general for both sexes, when you're talking about opposite sex attraction, if you had an older mum or dad, you're likely to find an older partner more attractive than if you had a younger one. And he's done the same kind of thing with eye and hair colour as well. This is just an example taken off from anywhere that mum and daughter, mother-in-law and daughter look very, very similar in this case. And he's now looking, of course, at perhaps the much more interesting question, which is, are the effects in this case also seen with children of adopted parents? And if you want to actually join in this study, you can log into perceptionlab.com, where he's actually currently conducting this study. What other impacts can different parenting styles have? Well, perhaps the most interesting experiments are from a Canadian scientist in McGill University, Michael Meany and his group, where they've found that rat mums tend to have two different sorts of parenting strategies. It doesn't seem to have any impact on whether the pups survive or not, I should hasten to say from the outset. But they're either characterized by low licking and grooming frequencies, so low touchy-feely, if you like, as opposed to high licking and grooming. And they've sort of selectively bred these two lines to see what impact the different amount of parental touching might have on their offspring. And the first thing they reported was very similar to animals that don't have a parent at all, that you get very enhanced stress responses. These are hormones that are stress indicators, occurring in animals that have the sort of low attentive mothers, the low touchy-feely ones, and there's a very strong correlation between the amount of licking and grooming that pups receive and their stress response. Interestingly, he's also shown, I won't go into details, this is a particular cognitive task often used in rodents called the Morris-Water maze, that he did the same sort of cross-fostering experiments. So he took normal high licking grooming mothers and left them with their pups. He then also took pups born to high licking mothers and cross-fostered them onto low licking mothers and all the combinations. And what he showed was that there seemed to be the high attentive mothers conveyed an advantage in terms of the distance travelled in this particular task. The lower the distance you travel, the better your learning in this case, to their pups. And this was transferred from high-licking mothers to low-licking born pups if they were transferred to them. So an effective experience of the mother having the high-licking and grooming gave you a sort of a cognitive enhancement, even though your own biological mum was of the low attentive variety. And if you looked at the structure that's very important for this and a particular marker of synaptic changes in this synaptophysin. Exactly the same thing happened, that the level of synapse growth within this hippocampal structure was hugely increased when pups born to low-licking mothers were actually brought up by high-licking mothers. But interestingly, if you took the high-licking mother's pups and put them on the low-licking mother's pups, there wasn't an impairment. So she was already capable of passing on something in her genes that would actually make them, to some extent, bomb-proof from the issue of their mother, in this case, being less attentive towards them. And again, you can take this with a pinch of salt, but in human studies, the level of parental attentiveness in this case, which is gauged by the amount of time that the mother and father are in full-time occupation in the first 5 years of life, shows that in terms of getting A-level grades, there's longer this period is of full-time work, the less likely you are for the children to actually pass their A-levels. Not necessarily passing A-levels is a mark of intelligence, I would say. The other thing, because very controversially, is whether personality traits like aggression can be passed on. And again, this is very controversial in humans, but cross-fostering work in Californian mice, I won't go into this in detail, but effectively it shows that the Californian mouse, which is very, very aggressive, if you then raise young from a white-footed mouse that are not aggressive on her, they will become aggressive, and vice versa if you do it the other way around. So it would appear that mum, rather than genes, can at least convey the change in aggressive personalities in this particular case. Other things like social dominance are also known to be passed on, particularly in primates, where it doesn't really matter who gave birth to you, the actual perceived dominance of your mum will affect the way that you're treated by everybody else, and it's extremely difficult to escape from that. And another thing which is again very controversial is dietary preferences, where social transmission in general is known to be very important in animals as well as humans. And we know from work on, again, species like sheep, that when mums pass on learned preferences and aversions, they tend to last an awful lot longer than they do if they learn from other individual siblings or subsequently from conspecifics. So there's something particularly special about mums. And this has also, to some extent, been reported in humans, given that the early life period when you tend to have the strongest contact with your parents is very important for liking to accept a wide variety of foods. And as far as one sort of area, which is obesity, which is very much in the increase and can't be all explained by genetic changes, if you have no parents that are obese, you only have about a 7% chance of becoming obese. If your mother, particularly, just one parent is obese, that shoots up to 40%. And it goes with both parents, it goes up to 70%. So it's likely that parents can pass on some aspects of this, in this case, the preference for fats. Of course, the other thing that mums pass on, like this chimpanzee are doing, is actually how to get food. And she will spend nearly 5 years trying to teach her youngster, in this case, how to crack nuts and open them. So let's wind it up now by trying to come to some conclusions about what I've been trying to tell you. In the first place, parental care in any species allows them really to deal with the most difficult of environments, to adapt to anything that nature may have to throw at them. And it does provide a species with the best possible situation to develop social and emotional and cooperative ties. It also allows for greater social transmission of survival skills, and even, as I've tried to make the point with the sheep studies and goat studies, perhaps even social and sexual attraction to members of the opposite sex. Also, things like which foods to eat and how to get them are clearly important as far as parental education is concerned. In general, therefore, having good attentive parents will also enhance the social competence that you have and your ability to deal with stress. And they may even, this is somewhat more controversial, help you at least make the most of your intellectual skills. However, other aspects of their behavior, like aggression and social dominance, which might be perceived in a more negative light, can also be passed on. The other thing that's important to say is that parents are only likely to have any impact during the early stages of development, probably in humans. Probably the main area of influence is in the first 5 years. So, in answer to the question, is having a good parent more important than having good genes? Of course, I'm going to end up probably sitting on what you consider to be the fence, but then that was where I was going to start off with from the introduction I gave you. The important thing about parents is that they do help to create a very strong and social and emotional base for their offspring. And as a result of that, you know, it's great having good genes, but there's not much point in having them if you can't cope with the environment in which you're actually having to deal with them in your social environment. So in that sense, parents are very, very important for allowing you to exploit the gene advantages that you have. So not only, of course, can they promote genetic advantages, but of course one has the other side of the coin. They can also promote the expression of more negative